The young and the restless spoilers. The tension in Genoa City had reached an unbearable pitch, a suffocating pressure that clung to every breath, every whispered suspicion, every glance thrown across a crowded room. It all centered on a single item that had vanished without a trace, a poisoned liquor bottle that had already set into motion a chain of destruction no one could stop. Its absence was more dangerous than its presence. What had once been considered evidence had now become the cornerstone of an invisible war, a war where loyalty fractured, truths twisted into traps, and the line between predator and prey blurred until even the most steadfast hearts faltered. The police scoured every inch of the premises, yet the bottle remained lost, a ghost that haunted the investigation. This wasn't a simple disappearance, it was a deliberate act. Someone had removed the bottle, someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who didn't want it found, at least not yet. And so suspicion grew like mold in the shadows, coating everything with unease. Chance was the first to speak the words others feared to say. He suspected Nick. Not because he had proof, but because he had instincts honed by years of chasing lies and truths that wore each other's masks. Chance believed that Nick, in a desperate bid to protect himself or perhaps someone else, had hidden the bottle. Not just hidden it, but preserved it for a reason, perhaps for leverage, or maybe to carry out a twisted plan of his own. But that theory clashed violently with Nick's demeanor. Nick wasn't calculating. He was unraveling. His confusion wasn't rehearsed, it was raw, frantic, real. He stood before his accusers not as a man hiding something, but as someone who couldn't even comprehend how he had ended up in this nightmare. He swore again and again that he had nothing to do with the poisoned drink, that he was being framed, used, set up to take a fall that wasn't his. Yet nothing he said could clear the fog. Because there was still the matter of the drink itself, a bottle of a rare, refined bourbon that Kane had always loved. Not just loved, revered. It was his trademark indulgence, the one thing he never compromised on. And that, more than anything, terrified him. Because the person who chose to use that exact drink to conceal the poison didn't do so randomly. It was a message. A signature. It told Kane that whoever had orchestrated this knew him, deeply and intimately. They knew his habits, his cravings, his weaknesses. This wasn't an act of violence. It was a performance. Choreographed. Personal. And it made Kane feel exposed in a way he hadn't felt since his darkest days. The thought that someone had been watching him, learning him, preparing to destroy him in a way that would feel like betrayal, it shook him to the core. And the ripples didn't stop there. Whispers spread like fire in dry brush. That perhaps an abbot was next to fall. That the web had been spun not just for revenge or chaos, but with a calculated endgame. The idea that one of the abbot men would soon face judgment. Whether legal, moral, or mortal, wasn't just gossip. It felt inevitable. And in Genoa City, inevitability was often the prelude to catastrophe. The signs were there if you looked closely. A carefully timed leak. A whispered name in the wrong ear. A shift in tone, a look that lingered too long. It all pointed to a master manipulator, someone who had studied the families, mapped their patterns, and was now moving pieces on a chessboard only he could see. And once again, Nick found himself branded as the villain. A role he hadn't asked for, didn't want, and couldn't escape. It was the same story rewritten in sharper ink. Every time the chaos reached a boiling point, he was thrust into the center. It didn't matter that he had spent years rebuilding, making amends, learning from past mistakes. To the world, he would always be the reckless son of a tycoon, the man who walked into fire not to save others, but because he didn't know how to stop dancing with destruction. But this time, he wasn't just angry. He was devastated. Because somewhere deep down, he feared that the truth didn't matter anymore. Not when perception had already written the ending. The target, however, was never really Nick. It was Billy. That much became terrifyingly clear. Billy. The eternal rebel, the defiant wild card, the man who lived with one foot out the door and both fists raised against rules he refused to follow. He was unpredictable, erratic, uncontainable. And that, it seemed, had finally caught up with him. Somewhere in the back rooms of Genoa City's elite circles, someone had marked Billy as the next to fall. Not because he had done anything new, but because his refusal to play by the rules had always made him a threat. He wasn't manipulable. He couldn't be tamed. And so he would be eliminated, not through confrontation, but through seduction and routine. Through the very things he trusted. That night, Billy walked into the bar as he had countless times before. It was a familiar place, dimly lit and humming with low conversations and clinking glasses. He ordered his favorite drink without hesitation, unaware that someone had been waiting for that exact moment. The poisoned bourbon had returned, not in the bottle, but in the glass. Disguised in amber warmth, it glowed with the promise of comfort, of ritual, of escape. And Billy, always too sure of himself to see the traps laid by quieter minds, lifted the glass with the same careless confidence that had defined his life. He drank. And then the world shifted. The poison moved fast, engineered to be both silent and spectacular. A sudden breath caught in his throat, a strange burn that wasn't alcohol, a wave of dizziness that turned the bar's soft lights into a kaleidoscope of dread. His fingers trembled as the glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, the sound loud and sharp, a warning bell too late. He collapsed, not with drama, but with inevitability. Like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And in that moment, everything else fell away. The bar froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses hung in mid-air. Time stuttered. Then chaos erupted. Shouts for help, panicked hands dialing 911, someone checking for a pulse, others backing away as if death were contagious. And outside, the one who had orchestrated it all slipped into the night unnoticed. The poison had done its job. The message had been delivered. And a new storm was now coming to Genoa City. Billy's condition became the focal point of a renewed investigation. The reappearance of the poison, now administered in a public space, to a high-profile figure, escalated the situation to crisis level. The missing bottle was no longer just evidence, it was the thread connecting multiple crimes. And its vanishing act now looked like the prelude to a larger, more coordinated attack. Nick's insistence that he was innocent took on a new urgency. He demanded answers, demanded protection, demanded to know who wanted to ruin his life. But answers remained elusive, buried beneath layers of manipulation. Chance, torn between his duty and his instincts, began questioning his own suspicions. Could it be that Nick wasn't the architect of this nightmare, but just another pawn? If so, then who was pulling the strings? And why had they chosen the bourbon, a drink that both Kane and Billy favored, as the vessel for their destruction? Was the poison meant for one of them? Both? Or was it all a test, to see who would fall and who would survive? Kane, for his part, retreated into paranoia. Every interaction felt like surveillance. Every kind word carried a double edge. He wondered if the killer was close, an employee, a friend, maybe even someone in his family. His grip on reality frayed as he questioned everything, including himself. The poison wasn't just killing people. It was rotting trust, infecting relationships, sowing chaos that couldn't be undone. And somewhere out there, the mastermind waited. Watching. Listening. Preparing for the next move. The poisoned bourbon had been a prologue. The real game had only just begun. The hospital lights glowed harshly against the sterile white walls, but they were the only source of hope left as Billy lay unconscious, machines rhythmically tracking every fragile breath. News of his poisoning spread through Genoa City and across the sea to those with blood ties and buried loyalties. Jill, hearing of her son's critical condition, made preparations without hesitation. Nothing, no business, no grudge, no continent, would stop her from being at Billy's bedside. Her relationship with him had always been complicated, volatile, shaped by pride and past failures, but at the end of the day, he was her son. And now he hovered at the brink between life and death, caught in the crossfire of a war he didn't know he was part of. Speculation erupted around whether the poison had done its final damage. Would this be the end of Billy, a man so often reckless, so often spared by fate? The question burned through the minds of those who loved and hated him alike. But those who truly understood the mechanics of storytelling, of legacy, of soap opera law, knew the truth: Billy wouldn't die. Not like this. Not at the hands of a faceless enemy with no resolution. His story was too entangled, his presence too integral. He might suffer, he might change, but he would survive, if only to uncover the truth behind this calculated strike. And so, with time, the swelling subsided, the machines slowed, and Billy opened his eyes. Groggy, furious, confused, but alive. What came next wasn't relief, it was obsession. Billy's mind, still recovering from the neurotoxin, locked onto a single truth: someone had tried to kill him, and they had come terrifyingly close. His instincts flared to life, pushing past the pain, the weakness, the medical advice to rest. He didn't care about recovery. He cared about justice. He needed to know who had slipped that drink into his hand, who had chosen that bar, that night, that method. Because this wasn't just a warning shot, it was an execution attempt. And it meant something. It meant everything. Meanwhile, Chance's world shifted yet again. He had never stopped investigating the missing bourbon bottle, never stopped replaying the sequence of events that led to its disappearance. But nothing prepared him for what he found next. In an unmarked, nearly forgotten corner of the Newman estate, tucked in the nightstand of Nick's private bedroom, was the bottle. The bottle. The exact same make, the exact same label, confirmed via a preliminary lab test as containing the same toxin that nearly ended Billy's life. Chance stood there, motionless, for a long time, staring at the object that had become the heart of a mystery far darker than he'd imagined. How had it gotten here? Why would Nick hide it in his own room? Was it arrogance? Or fear? Nick, upon being confronted, didn't lash out. He didn't scream. He didn't run. Instead, he crumbled, not into guilt, but into disbelief. The bottle was in his room. That was a fact. But Nick had no memory of putting it there. He swore he hadn't touched it, hadn't even seen it since it vanished days ago. He hadn't left his room. No one had come in. And yet, there it was, glowing like a curse in the hands of the man he once called a friend. Chance was caught between protocol and instinct. The evidence was damning. But Nick's panic wasn't a performance. It was pure. Unfiltered. Real. And that made things worse, not better. Because if Nick hadn't placed the bottle there, someone else had. And that someone had access, knowledge, and a reason to ruin Nick, permanently. Now the investigation was no longer just about who poisoned Billy. It became a question of how deep this conspiracy went. Nick was either the most careless criminal Genoa City had ever seen, or the most precisely chosen scapegoat. Chance began retracing every detail: who had access to the Newman estate, who had motive, who would benefit from Nick being eliminated from the equation. And most troubling of all, why was the bottle still intact? Why hadn't the real killer destroyed it after the attack on Billy? Why return it, knowing it could be traced? Unless, of course, the point wasn't to escape justice, but to direct it. To engineer a conviction. To shape a narrative where Nick Newman was guilty beyond doubt. Back in the hospital, Billy began to speak, first to Jill, then to Victoria, and finally to anyone who would listen. He remembered the bar, the drink, the faint scent of the bourbon, the familiarity of it. He didn't believe in coincidences. Someone had lured him there, made sure he would order that drink, and timed it so that the moment he lifted the glass would be the moment the trap closed. It wasn't sloppy. It was artful. And that terrified him. Because if someone could get to him like that, knowing his habits, exploiting his comforts, then no one was safe. And he didn't believe Nick had the subtlety to pull it off. But even as Billy spoke, cracks began to appear in the narrative. Certain details weren't adding up. The bartender who served him had vanished. Security footage was missing. The register logs had been tampered with. Whoever planned this had erased their tracks, except for one strange inconsistency. A matchbook from the bar found near Nick's bedstand, smeared with condensation as if it had been hastily handled. It was the final straw for Chance, who now saw the broader picture. Nick wasn't covering his tracks, he was being framed, every detail placed with surgical precision to ensure he couldn't defend himself. Someone had broken in, planted the evidence, and left without a trace. The real question was, how long had they been planning this? And what did it have to do with Kane? Kane, who had been rattled ever since the first poisoning attempt, began to spiral anew. The bourbon was his favorite drink. The same brand had been used on Billy. Was he the original target? Had someone meant to kill him, and Billy had taken the fall by accident? That possibility haunted him. But even more disturbing was the knowledge that whoever did this understood them all far too well. The choice of poison, the method of delivery, the planting of the bottle, it spoke of a mind obsessed with detail, with symbolism. A mind that wasn't finished. As Genoa City held its breath, Nick remained trapped in a cage of fear and accusation. Chance, though beginning to believe in his innocence, was still bound by evidence. Billy, back from the brink, was now determined to become hunter instead of prey. And Kane, ever paranoid, ever calculating, began forming alliances of his own. Somewhere, the mastermind watched it all unfold, a conductor in the shadows waiting for the next crescendo. Because the bottle had returned, but the real poison was only just beginning to spread. Let me know if you'd like the next part to focus on Jill confronting Victor or Chance in Nice, Phyllis finding clues to help Nick or possibly betraying him, a new suspect emerging from the Abbott or Winters family, or I can continue the story directly into the next segment.